historic week for the nation. The U.S. Supreme Court sets the course for same-sex marriage for years to come in America. DOMA is dead, Prop 8 is dead, and the debate continues. But another ruling tears apart one of the pillars of the civil rights movement in the Voting Rights Act. Today, we're sitting down with a member of the Stonewall Democrats for his take on this week, and our political insiders will debate. It's all coming up on this edition of Indianapolis This Week.
From RTV6, Indianapolis This Week.
Welcome to Indianapolis This Week. I'm Jenna Kooi. People across the nation are celebrating the Supreme Court rulings on same-sex marriage. But for many, this debate will continue. The Supreme Court struck down the Federal Defense of Marriage Act and declined to rule on a lower court ruling that overturned California's ban on same-sex marriage. That means gay and lesbian couples are now eligible for more than 1,000 federal marriage benefits. And gays in California will be able to wed within the next month. Still, a majority of states ban same-sex marriage.
For same-sex couples, it's a complicated patchwork. You can be married in one state and be treated as legal strangers to each other in a different state. And that's the piece that by court decisions and legislation has to be fixed.
While same-sex marriage is already illegal in Indiana, the rulings have reignited the debate over a proposed constitutional amendment banning it. State lawmakers have dropped the issue since February, when legislative leaders put off the debate on the amendment until after the Supreme Court ruling. Well, now that fight is back on. RTV6 reporter Norman Cox has that story.
On February 7th, Republican legislative leaders announced there would be no vote on the constitutional amendment limiting a marriage to one man and one woman until after the Supreme Court ruling. Now that the ruling has been issued, the truce is over. Nothing the justices said keeps states like Indiana from banning same-sex marriage or strengthening existing bans. So there will almost certainly be a legislative vote in 2014. Republican leaders declined to go on TV today, but both issued statements, with House Speaker Brian Bosma saying, "I am confident the matter will come before the General Assembly and ultimately be placed on a referenda ballot." Supporters of traditional marriage say they're confident they'll win with lawmakers and voters.
But the question about what marriage is for Hoosiers is alive and well here in Indiana. We look forward to working with the Indiana General Assembly to advance our definition, and under today's ruling, that would even bind the federal government. We believe Hoosiers should make this decision, not courts and not activists.
But gay rights supporters say they'll fight the issue in the legislature and at the polls, and they question whether a same-sex ban would stand up under future court challenges.
Here's what I would ask the Indiana legislature. What happens to a gay, legally married couple in Maryland who are assigned to Fort Meade or some other military installation and get transferred to the finance center? Do they lose their state's rights automatically? And that kind of commerce issue is going to start to become more into play every day and every passing hour. We think that ultimately that kind of drip, drip, drip will make the legislature realize this is something they cannot escape, and they need to change their minds about this issue.
On Wednesday, Governor Mike Pence issued a statement in response to the Supreme Court rulings, saying, quote, "While I am disappointed that the Supreme Court has overturned DOMA, I am grateful that today's decision respects the sovereignty of states on this important issue." He goes on to say the people of Indiana should have their say about how marriage is understood and defined in our state. And the people of Indiana have weighed in on same-sex marriage in a recent study conducted by Ball State University. The study finds more than half of Hoosiers oppose banning same-sex marriage. In late 2012, the Bowen Center's annual Hoosier survey found 55% of Hoosiers support civil unions and 45% are okay with same-sex marriage. 54% of those who took the survey oppose a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage in Indiana. And joining us now is Aaron Shaler of the Stonewall Democrats. Aaron, thank you so much for joining us today. First, for people who are not familiar, what are the Stonewall Democrats?
The Indiana Stonewall Democrats, we're an organization, part of the state Indiana Democratic Party, and our mission is to elect pro-equality Democrats.
All right, so what were your feelings then personally on the Supreme Court rulings this week?
Well, I was ecstatic. It gave many Americans full equality in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of their state and in the federal authorities, which is really, really great. Unfortunately, only 30% of Americans have the opportunity to live in a state where marriage equality is legal. However, it gave us all a roadmap forward, because the movement isn't going to end with the court's decision. We still have a lot of work to do.
Why do you think the justices ruled the way they did? Why did they strike down DOMA?
Well, As I'm not an attorney, however, when I read the decision, it was obviously apparent to the Supreme Court that DOMA was unconstitutional, that it went against people's individual rights of, you know, liberty, freedom, and, you know, all of that wonderful American stuff.
And the justices decided to really not touch on Prop 8. Was that enough for you?
You know, it was. It gave those the marriages in California, you know, it made them legal again, which is great, and it gave more Californians the opportunity to marry within the next month, as you stated earlier. I would have liked for it to have gone further, but I'm happy to take half of a loaf than no loaf at all.
That's true. It's a step forward then.
Absolutely.
In your opinion. But then here in Indiana, right after the decision, the debate reignited here at home to get a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Was that a blow?
No, I think that anybody that didn't expect to see that coming isn't going to live in reality. Of course, we expected the Speaker and President Long to come out with their statements. I think that the governor, as he has no vote on the issue, went a little bit too far, especially with his Facebook posts. It's just it's reasons like that that Hoosiers need to stand up and pay attention to the actions of their governor instead of, you know, just the whole status quo, which is what he's trying to continue pushing.
Well, you mentioned Hoosiers as a people. Do you think their attitudes have changed in the past few years on same-sex marriage?
Hoosiers or Republicans?
Both. What do you think?
Rank and file Hoosiers, yes. Some of my very good friends who are Republicans support my right to marry, all of their other friends' rights for marriage equality. Do I think that the leaders in both House chambers and the governor want to look at it as a fundraising tool for their political parties, especially as the vote for the constitutional amendment is going to happen just before a potential primary battle? Yes, I think they're going to use it 100% for political purposes.
All right, now you mentioned the Facebook post and that little controversy that Governor Mike Pence has been dealing with, taking the posts off and then apologizing. How big of a political nightmare is this for the governor?
You know, I think it's huge. I think especially with the last administration, they saw a lot of social media affect different policies and procedures, and I think that this is just going to be another example. This governor, his Facebook page literally blew up in his face, and he didn't know what to do with it. Now, the governor did issue an apology today. Now, looking at my Facebook page today, do I think it was enough? No. Did he go far enough? No. Will Hoosiers remember it in November of 2016? I think so.
All right, time will tell. Aaron Shaler, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate it very much.
All right, thank you.
Now, after the break, our political insiders are joining us to weigh in on all of these critical court decisions, along with the future fight over same-sex marriage in Indiana. Don't go away. Joining us now are two of our political insiders, editor of IndyPolitics.org, Abdul Hakim Shabazz, and Democrat Laura Beck. Thank you so much, both of you being here. All right, we have to start with the big topic of the past few days, the Supreme Court rulings on same-sex marriage. First, what were your thoughts? Was it expected?
Yes. On the Defense of Marriage Act, not surprising at all that the federal government would define marriage contradictory to the states, which have always had the traditional role in defining marriage, so that was not surprising at all. I thought it was also interesting they sort of kicked the California Proposition 8 sort of back to the states, and the individuals didn't have standing, and although it's legalese, it says something interesting. I think what's really most interesting is what's going to happen next. You know, what happens when a couple that is, you know, same-sex couple legally married in Iowa moves to Indiana, something happens, one person is allowed to see another, property issues, child custody issues. The only people who are really going to get rich in all this are the lawyers and the wedding planners.
It's funny because when the news came out, I was actually in a meeting and I had to read it like several times. You know, sort of, I call it the ballad of the working mother. You know, I can only compartmentalize so much, so I had to really go through it a few times to make sure. But it was really actually very emotional because when you think about what that means for people, because you love someone who differently than the rest, than other people would define it, it's really a powerful statement. And I think it also is so profound for the impact that it has on politics going forward. And when you think about just within a few hours, was it a few hours maybe, that Indiana, our legislators, supermajority, and Governor Pence immediately came out and said, we're going to fight to put this on the ballot. The timing was really interesting. I think I would have let it cycle through for a day and then made my announcement and done it that way. But it really became a part of the story in Indiana, and I think it dampened some of the enthusiasm here in Indiana.
Was that the right move?
Well, see, I respectfully disagree. I mean, the Speaker and the Senate President had always said that they were going to wait until the U.S. Supreme Court.
They didn't wait very long. They really didn't give it a long time. 5 minutes. It's just like they had one press release ready for each issue.
Made a decision.
Like that's what they did.
And also you have to understand too is that there is a significant percentage of the Republican Party that believes that same marriage should only be between a man and a woman. Now, the question is when you get into the politics of all this, what's going on, et cetera, but it is not uncommon, the Speaker, the Senate President, the Governor have always maintained a position. They believe that marriage is between a man and a woman, but people should be treated with dignity and respect. Let the voters decide. I don't think necessarily if this got to the ballot, the supporters of the amendment would actually win because I've seen some data that shows they would actually probably lose.
Right, that's what I was going to ask you. This has to go to the people first before it can become an amendment, right?
Yeah, and the other thing I think that's really also that stands out about it is that Governor Pence ran on a pro-job agenda. He said, I'm not talking about social issues. I'm going to drive around in my big red truck and we're going to talk about jobs. And this is one of the pieces of legislation that businesses say, particularly large headquarters who are here, who are here in Indiana, but have employees all over the world and all over the country that say this is bad for business because it impacts our talent management and acquisition. And talent management and acquisition is what makes you money. And so what is so interesting about this is what he said, I'm going to take a stand on this, and he's going to put it out on the ballot, and he's going to go for it to be on the ballot in 2014.
Well, just so we're clear, the governor has no say over whether this gets on the ballot. This is purely.
Oh, I think if he had say, he would put it on the ballot yesterday.
This is all the legislature. I mean,
but he said, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it passes.
Yeah, well, I doubt if it's, like I said, once again, I doubt if it's going to pass.
But then again, we couldn't get the tax cut, so who knows? I shouldn't say
that. On the topic of the governor, his Facebook page and the comments that were against his opinion and taken off for different reasons, depending on who you want to talk to. But then the governor, a day later, apologizes. How big of a mess is this?
It is a mess, but it's not the end of the world. Knowing the people who work in the governor's office, people think there was somebody sinister in a basement somewhere, doing all this. That is not the case. There actually were some legitimate posts on Facebook that would probably get somebody sued for libel and defamation if you let it sit out there. I think what they learned is that they have to develop a policy on how you deal with this sort of thing. And it would have been one thing had just one or two things where you disagree, but when you start taking everything off, I mean, they're guilty of anything of just not having a really good, solid policy on how to deal with social media as an elected official.
But didn't the governor say, though, that most of the comments that were taken off were because they just simply disagreed with him?
Yeah, they were, and it looks bad. It's unfortunate because it looks bad, and the purpose of social media is open two-way communications. And what's concerning is that someone who gets paid by the state sat and deleted those messages all day long, or however long it took. And if you go to the Pencership website that came out, there are people who actually show the screenshots of where they're legitimately disagreeing. So the governor did the right thing by apologizing, but it sets a very dangerous precedent because it's something that average people can understand. How many times do you go to a Facebook page or do you go to a company's website and you say, hey, I had an issue. Can you help me with this? And to have your comment deleted as if it doesn't even matter is really disturbing to people. And I think that sticks with people. I don't think it's the end of the world, but it's not really the message you want to send your constituents.
Did the governor take too long to apologize, though? Because that first day he was kind of defending it, and then the next day he's like, all right, I apologize, this shouldn't have happened.
I don't think it took too long. I think, as you get new information, when people say, hey, Governor, originally we thought it was just offensive commentary, but now we found out there actually were, folks with just, expressing legitimate opinions. He did the right thing, which is, hey, we're sorry. I can assure you that they probably spent the weekend coming up with a Facebook policy on how to do this sort of thing. It would have been worse had they just sat there and denied, and make what's really just a 1-2 day story into a 1-2-3 week story.
Well, I think that the issue is hindsight's always 20/20, and the quicker, I think he let the air out of the balloon. From a PR perspective, he let the air out of the balloon, but the damage has really been done. There are people who have been blocked by him and by his office, and I probably think that he probably doesn't really care what other people think as it goes to gay marriage, because this is what he believes. But at the same time, I think he's savvy enough, because he's a former media person, to understand that he had to move, and he had to move quickly. I think it's always hard to say if somebody moved quickly enough or not, but unfortunately for them, the damage is done.
Is this a precursor to how bitter the fight is going to be when it goes statewide?
That is what I really do seriously am concerned about, is that the tone of this debate, the tone of this argument on both sides of the issue, going to be a lot of people saying a lot of things that really aren't necessary, kind of go into that sort of Hoosier hospitality. So it'll be interesting to see if we can sort of elevate, keep the debate, the discussion elevated, because for a lot of people this is a very personal issue,
an emotional
issue, and some people have religious convictions, both different ways. So this is going to be the test of how well the Hoosiers can they behave, and when we have this discussion.
All right, well, this will keep playing out for the next few months as we see what happens. All right, stay right there, because we have a lot more to talk about after the break. We'll be back with our insiders. We're talking with our political insiders, Laura Beck and Abdul Hakim Shabazz. Final thoughts on same-sex marriage?
Well, as we talk about same-sex marriage, and as we also talk about how it moves its way through the legislature, one of the points that I wanted to make before the break, before I don't want to interrupt my good friend here, but I personally think it's really shameful that in Indiana we're spending this much time at the legislative level to do this, especially because we have thousands of children in Indiana who are hungry. Childhood poverty has increased 35% between 2005 and 2011. We shelved mass transit. We are constantly fighting poverty. We're fighting smoking. We're fighting all of these different things, but yet we're going to spend taxpayer time, money, and effort on this. And I think it's just really disappointing that this is what some of our legislators want to focus on. And I think it will ultimately hurt them when it comes down to 2014. That was my last piece. Thank you, Abdul.
Well, like I said, I think
and you have to respond.
No. I mean, my position on this issue has been pretty clear from day one. Everybody's entitled to be happy as my wife. Said it once before. I said it 100 million times. And I caution my Republican friends.
Let's see his wife's reaction.
The lovely Mrs. Shabazz.
And I do think something to keep in mind is, as we look at the demographics of how attitudes have changed over the marriage issue, I don't think my conservative friends, that this is their passion, fully understand how much things have changed.
Right, the numbers show they have changed.
Right, if you look 40 and under, and there are a lot of young Republicans who are conservative, they don't care. And then tie in the fact that, whereas maybe 20, 30 years ago, maybe you did know someone who was gay or lesbian, now basically everybody does. And it's very hard to demonize people that you know personally.
Right. Well, and we were talking about this in the we try not to talk too much in the green room because we don't want to take away from the fun here. But we were talking in the green room just a little bit about wherever you go in Indiana, that same element is true. And so when you are putting something like this on a referendum, you're voting against your neighbor, you're voting against your colleague or your family member, for example. So Abdul is right, and I can't even believe I said this, but it is hard to demonize the lifestyle of someone when you see them every day or they're in your family and you work with them every day.
You're putting a face on the issue, a face that you know and you like.
Absolutely, absolutely. So how this all plays out is going to be fascinating.
All right, well, I'm sure you'll be here to talk many more times about that. We'd appreciate that.
We'll try.
Another big ruling that came down, the Voting Rights Act. Explain what that was and how that affects Indiana, if it really does.
It does not affect Indiana in the sense that just to give everybody a real brief history, after the Civil War, you had segregation and voter...
We're going back to the Civil War here.
Technically, you have to to fully appreciate this.
We only have a few minutes here.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have much time.
You had a number of states with a history of disenfranchising voters. My parents who grew up in Mississippi, Alabama, got to see a lot of that stuff firsthand. All the Supreme Court said is that in these states where we used to have these problems, 1961, it was 50 years ago, it is now 2013, you have a lot more African-American participation, a lot more African-American elected officials. So this one provision of the Civil Rights Act or Voting Rights Act where the states need to get clearance from the federal government to move a polling place or change a voting time, you don't need to do anymore. There's still a number of guarantees of protection there to protect voting rights. This is just one section that was 50-something years result. Times have changed. It was time to move on.
I had a little bit of whiplash actually last week because you have the voting rights decision, and then you have
Very progressive.
Then you have DOMA, and then you have what what the
DOMA,
Supreme Court did. Yeah, so I think in Indiana it is disappointing, but in Indiana the Republicans have pushed through some of the most restrictive voter registration, voter ID laws in the nation. So I don't think it's going to affect us that much. It is disappointing, but I don't know how much of an effect we'll see in Indiana.
Yeah, and I don't see how, and I once again have to respectfully disagree with my good friend here. I don't see how, Barack Obama got elected president in 2008 with voter ID and these restrictive voting things.
Well, if you watch Fox News, it's all Acorn's fault.
Joe Donnelly won, even despite all these restrictive things. Linda Ritz won. So Democrats, for some strange reason, have managed. Democrats tend to do almost well.
We have managed to win. Is that what you were going to say?
You do every well except for the mayor's race in Marion County with all these restrictive voter things. So if this stuff is so bad and so horrible, how do Democrats keep winning?
Do you think people really care about this decision who are involved in politics? Do they notice? Does it affect their lives?
I think people do care. I do think people care but in Indiana, we have really made, particularly with the Democrats, we've made it very clear. This is what you need to do to make sure you're registered. Make sure you bring your ID to the polls. Make sure you do all these things. So we've made it very, very clear. But I do think around the country, there are many, many people who are very disappointed.
Voter ID polls at like 90%.
Well, it depends on how you ask the question. It depends on how you ask the question for voter ID to poll.
Voter ID polls at 90%.
Come on.
And even Indiana's voter ID
Whose
law.
poll are you talking about?
Went to the Supreme Court and they said, you know what? It's fine. It's not disenfranchising voters.
It is disenfranchising, but at the same time, you have to find a way to work around it.
And voter ID has been the law of the land since 2006. If you haven't voted since then, that sounds like a personal problem.
All right, we'll agree to disagree. To both of you. As always. Always. That keeps it entertaining.
I wish.
Thank you. And you can stay updated on political news anytime by following our insiders, Laura, Jennifer, Kip, and Abdul, on our Capitol Watch blog. You can find the link on our webpage, theindychannel.com. Indianapolis This Week continues after the break. RTV6 is proud to be your home for Indianapolis Indians baseball, and you can see this afternoon's game right here. The broadcast for today's game will begin at 1:30. Catch it all right here on RTV6. That's it for this edition of Indianapolis This Week. I'm Jenna Kooi. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great Sunday.